to be undivided with the Roman Catholic Church, probably, I'm sure, most more from home. Apparently, the feast disappeared from Anglican worship in 1549, and it's reappeared in bits and pieces in the 20th century. And the assumption isn't we assume things about Mary, as has been suggested. The assumption is the belief that Mary didn't die, but was assumed taken up into heaven, body and soul, following the end of her life on earth, just in case you weren't sure what the assumption was. Given that it's such an unusual feast, I wonder why we choose to celebrate it, or more particularly, why I choose to celebrate it today. Well, maybe partly to break up ordinary time, but that's not actually true. I think it's because of Mary. Because I think that Mary, the narrative that attaches to her, stirs up mixed feelings, and often strong feelings. My mother, who's in her 90s, remembers detail of Catholics throwing stones at Protestants and Protestants throwing stones at Catholics. The great divide between us back in the day. And of course anything to do with statues and churches idolatry. So there's that kind of very strong energy about Mary. The words that are given to Mary in the Magnificat are very beautiful and beautifully sung. That Magnificat was Chris Adams, one of our singers here, was the one that wrote the Magnificat, so that was very beautiful. But they are a lot more than that. They name the God that Mary accepts she has the capacity to bear and to bring to life in real time. That God aligns with the powerless, aligns with those in need, those excluded, and those cast out. They're words that speak to the heart. We know what they name to be true, and we don't need to be coerced into that. Yet over time, these words, their insistence that those who have and hold and wield power unjustly will be held accountable, I think they've become tamed. I think they've become domesticated. Much as I think Mary has. She's come to serve in a place that tradition requires of her. And perhaps that is why she engenders such a mix of feelings. On the one hand, she proclaims divine justice will come to life through her. On the other hand, and over time, her acceptability appears to be contingent upon her remaining virginal and pure and holy and untouchable. As if Mary was necessary in the narrative that tells of her as the virginal recipient of the daddy God with an intention to deliver a firstborn son who will save the world. The person of Mary, at this stage, the Magnificat, becomes an unwed, pregnant teenager. That gets a little overshadowed by what it leads to in the story that leads up to it. But I wanted to stop and ask you for a moment, if you can remember back last century when I think most of us were teenagers, George, you're an exception, not there yet. I want to ask you from your life experience, that vulnerable teenage time, do you remember all that was associated with an unwed, pregnant teenager? The stigma and the shame, the fear of economic and social ruin, the actions that were taken to disappear and to deny and to conceal, especially for the young woman who was pregnant. Not so much for the man, maybe because that was hard to prove. Why was it like that? Why is it like that? What is the foundational story that affirms that the blessing of bearing new life has to be told like that? Who decided? Well, narratives are powerful things. We story our world, and the way we do so shapes and informs how we think, how we see, how we interpret and understand the world. They shape who we are. We are recipients of narratives that have shaped us, but we're also the storytellers. We are the ones that determine how that narrative is going to be told, because they're not ended yet. However, to do so, we need to know how the story we receive got its shape, how it was formed. Then we can see better how we have been formed. then we can choose more intentionally how we want to tell it. The place of Mary is very much influenced by the place of Eve. There's no getting away from it. Irenaeus of our tradition puts it this way, blessed be he. Eve, having become disobedient, was made the cause of death both for herself and for all the human race. The knot of Eve's disobedience was loosened through the obedience of Mary. For what the Virgin Eve bound through unbelief, the Virgin Mary loosed through faith. Let's not forget, Eve is a character in a mythical creation story. A story our tradition over time has told in such a way that Eve is cast as the perpetrator of the fall. I, like many of you, have probably received the Garden of Eden story and the Genesis 2 version that tells of the fall from the pages of a Bible that's probably written in English. Some of you may be Hebrew scholars, I'm not. And English and the story that's been translated from language to language across culture and through time. And as you know, every language has its nuance and its culture. Every translator chooses their best understanding from the sense of what a story or a text intends. As I said, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I looked for someone who is to ask about this creation. And I was surprised by what I found, so I want to share just a little bit of it with you. The story was written for a largely pagan audience who understood evil as residing in nature, and that nature was a moral agent, able to do good or bad. The essence of the Garden of Eden story is that humans are created with free will. We can choose. But choices have consequences. And the consequences are what distinguish between the two choices given to Adam and to Eve. Between a benign, immortal existence in a utopia, whose daily existence is without consequence, or a mortal life in which consequences follow choice, and that such consequences, both good and bad, set it apart from life in Eden. The experience of suffering and joy are not due to the deeds of capricious gods. Nature is morally inert. Humans are responsible for their actions. And this is really interesting. That primordial couple is not portrayed as disobedient, nor their suffering or punishment administered by God. Humans are portrayed as creatures capable of their own choices, as are the consequences with which they must live. They were warned what would happen if they ate of the fruit of the tree. They weren't forbidden from eating it, and weren't commanded not to eat it. That's just an interesting nuance. They were told what would happen if they did eat from it. But they weighed the consequences, and they made their choice. So the garden story is about the exercise of free will, and the lesson that those graced with free will must also bear the consequences of their choices, for good or for bad. Well, Adam and Eve were cuddling together under the tree when that moment happened, but they made this choice together. But Eve was the first one to step into the mortal world with consequences. Eve was the first one to step toward life with all that brings. Joseph Campbell writes, "Woman brings life into the world. Eve is the mother of this temporal world. Formerly you had a dream-time paradise there in the Garden of Eden. There was no time. There was no birth. There was no death. There was no life." And let's not forget, a myth is a narrative to help us make sense of the way things are, the way the world is. What has this to do with Mary? Mary stands in the lineage of Eve, a woman with a choice to make that would have consequences, significant consequences. Mary was not forced to say yes. In fact, if common sense had prevailed, I imagine she would have run for the hills. But she stayed, and she chose to say yes. Then it became real. Yes, to conceiving, making real in time, birthing that divine life as knowable in human form, revealing our potential and our capacity and our responsibility to incarnate and enact the divine priority for life. Unbelievable. Inconceivable. And yet by saying yes, that initiated the consequence. That is real. Yet, the narrative of our tradition is written by men of a particular time and culture. Exacerbated by the patriarchal culture in which they were embedded, it largely colonises the radical heart and act of this woman, and the lineage of faithful women before and continuing since. And once granted the authority of tradition, especially a God tradition, to question and probe the authority of such men is rather fraught. But I don't want this to be a rally cry against the misogyny and patriarchy of our tradition. I want to avoid the associated battle cries and words of anger and rage or power and might. I don't want to feed the fires that still burn and have burned that way far too long. What I want to do is to pay attention to Mary and to Eve and to their choices, which are an alternative way. Their way that breathes life into, that asserts and insists and acts. So now, in real time, the divine priority for inclusion and justice is made real, and it's up to us. Their dignified stepping toward and into the messy complexity of life, with all it would bring, they chose that. Accepting their actions have consequences, so we are to be mindful and careful, and with thoughtful awareness to act with others, those like us, those not like us, and perhaps most importantly, the ones we find most challenging. We have inherited a narrative, good and bad, muddled, confused and confusing. Let us choose to be aware of our inheritance, for this narrative has not yet ended. How it will be told, the influence it will have, and how it may end, how our future in this world may end, that is in the telling. And you and I, each of us, have our part in the way that story will be told. And it may well be that the future, if there is to be a future for our world, depends on our telling.